Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little trip, not to some pristine beach or a bustling modern metropolis, but back in time. Way back. We're heading to the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the magnificent city of Constantinople. Now, you've probably seen those beautiful paintings and read about its grand churches and impressive walls, right? But tonight we're peeling back the layers of romanticized history and diving deep into the grim, gritty, and often downright awful reality of what urban living was really like for the average person in medieval Constantinople. Get ready for a sensory overload, and trust me, not always the good kind. You'll be thinking twice about complaining about your modern plumbing and air conditioning after this. Seriously, you probably wouldn't have survived a week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the mighty Golden Gate, a monumental entrance piercing the Theodosian walls. The formidable triple line of defense that has protected Constantinople for centuries. It's an imposing sight, yes, but as you step through, an immediate assault on your senses begins. The air, thick and heavy, isn't quite what you expected. It's a complex tapestry of smells, a truly medieval potpourri that quickly makes your nostrils flare. The dominant note is an earthy, pungent aroma, a mix of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely animalistic. Intertwined with this is the acrid tang of wood smoke rising from countless hearths where meals are cooked and homes are warmed. But then there's another layer, a sharper, more metallic scent, hinting at something less pleasant. You can't quite place it, but it's definitely not a pleasant perfume. As you push deeper into the city, the sounds are just as overwhelming. The steady clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes from a side street, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of a carpenter's axe. Street vendors, their voices hoarse, hawk their wares, shouting over the general din of human activity. Donkeys bray their protests, adding to the cacophony as they pull carts laden with goods, their hooves clattering on the uneven cobblestones. Children, their laughter surprisingly clear amidst the noise, chase each other through the narrow lanes, their bare feet slapping against the dirt. It's a constant, vibrant, and utterly relentless symphony of urban life, a far cry from the quiet, ordered world you're used to. Your ears ring with the sheer volume of it all, a constant reminder that you are no longer in your own time. The streets themselves are a challenge. They're not the wide paved avenues you might imagine from grand imperial cities. No, these are often winding, unpaved paths, churned into muddy quagmires by recent rain, or thick with dust in drier weather. Deep ruts carved by countless carts and hooves make walking a precarious endeavor. You have to constantly watch your step, lest you trip and fall into the accumulated refuse that lines the edges of the thoroughfare. And refuse there is in abundance. Not just discarded food scraps, but something far more unsettling. Animal droppings are everywhere, of course, from the working animals that are an integral part of city life. But then you notice the human waste casually tossed from upper-story windows or simply left in the gutters. It's a stark reminder that modern sanitation is a distant dream. Imagine trying to navigate this in the bustling daylight. People jostle past you, their coarse wool tunics brushing against your clothes. Their faces, often grimed with dirt and sweat, reveal the toil of their lives. Many avoid eye contact, focused on their own journeys, whether to the market, the workshop, or home. There's a palpable sense of purpose, a relentless drive to survive in this crowded, demanding environment. You notice the sheer density of the population. Homes are packed tightly together, their upper stories often jutting out over the street, casting the lower levels into perpetual shadow. These aren't just single-family dwellings. They're often multi-story structures housing numerous families, sometimes even workshops on the ground floor. Personal space is a luxury few can afford. One of the most striking things is the sheer lack of privacy. With so many people living in such close proximity, every sound, every conversation, every mundane act of daily life is potentially overheard. The thin walls offer little in the way of soundproofing, meaning that the joys and sorrows of your neighbors are constantly bleeding into your own existence. This constant proximity, while fostering a sense of community, in some ways also bred tension and conflict. Disputes over water rights, shared spaces, or even just noisy children were common occurrences, often escalating into full-blown arguments in the street. The air quality, even setting aside the smells, is another significant issue. The prevalence of open fires, both for cooking and heating, fills the atmosphere with particulate matter. In winter, when windows and doors are sealed against the cold, this smoke hangs heavy in the air, irritating lungs and eyes. Combine this with the ever-present dust and the emanations from the unhygienic streets, and you're inhaling a cocktail of pollutants with every breath. It's little wonder that respiratory ailments were a constant companion to urban life. As you wander, you realize that the city's beauty is often hidden behind a veil of grime and decay. While grand public buildings like the Hagia Sophia stand testament to imperial power and artistic achievement, the vast majority of residential buildings are far more modest, built from timber and brick, often poorly maintained. Plaster peels from walls, revealing the rough construction beneath. Roofs patched and repaired countless times, sag under the weight of time and neglect. This isn't the idealized image of a gleaming capital. It's a living, breathing, and often struggling city. The constant battle against vermin is also an undeniable part of life. Rats, drawn by the ubiquitous waste, scurry through the gutters and dark alleyways. Flies buzz around exposed food and refuse a constant nuisance and a carrier of disease. Fleas and lice are an inescapable reality, often finding their way into even the most carefully kept homes. You find yourself itching just thinking about it, a testament to how pervasive these creatures were in medieval urban environments. It's a constant low-level war against the unseen inhabitants that share your living space. Let's talk about the lack of proper sewage systems, a detail that truly underscores the challenges of urban living. While the Romans had impressive aqueducts and sewers, much of that infrastructure had fallen into disrepair or was simply inadequate for the burgeoning population of medieval Constantinople. Instead, human waste was often collected in privies that emptied into cesspits, or worse, simply thrown into the streets. Imagine the stench on a hot summer's day. The visual of human excrement flowing freely in the gutters is something you'd struggle to erase from your mind. It's a stark reminder of how fundamental modern sanitation is to our comfort and health. The concept of a municipal waste collection system, like the ones we take for granted today, simply didn't exist in any widespread effective form. This meant that the responsibility of waste disposal often fell to individual households, and their methods were, shall we say, less than ideal. This contributed significantly to the disease burden of the city. One popular historical debate revolves around the effectiveness of any attempts at public health initiatives in the Byzantine Empire. Historians still debate whether the sporadic imperial edicts regarding street cleanliness and waste disposal had any lasting impact on the overall hygiene of the city, or if they were largely unenforceable in the face of such a massive population. It's a fascinating point because while we have records of attempts to regulate, the lived reality seems to have been quite different. This is a common historical truth, isn't it? The gap between the law and its practical application. The narrowness of the streets meant that sunlight often struggled to reach the ground level, particularly in the dense residential areas. This created perpetually dim and damp conditions, perfect breeding grounds for mold and mildew, adding another layer of unpleasantness to the already challenging environment. It's a far cry from the open, airy spaces we design in modern cities where light and ventilation are prioritized. Instead, medieval architects were more concerned with maximizing living space within the city walls, leading to a cramped and somewhat claustrophobic urban fabric. And then there's the ever-present threat of fire. With so many timber structures packed closely together and open flames being the primary source of heat, and light fires were a constant menace. A single spark, a carelessly overturned lamp, or a kitchen fire left unattended could quickly engulf entire blocks, leaving thousands homeless in a matter of hours. The narrow, winding streets made it incredibly difficult for fire brigades, if they even existed in any organized form, to reach the blaze effectively. You can just imagine the terror of waking up to the screams of fire and seeing the orange glow consuming the night sky, knowing your entire livelihood could vanish in moments. This was a very real, very common fear for anyone living in Constantinople. Consider also the sheer lack of personal space, even beyond the narrow streets. If you lived in an insula, a multi-story apartment block, you might share a single room with your entire family. Beds would be makeshift, often just straw pallets on the floor. Privacy, as we understand it, was a foreign concept. Everything from eating to sleeping to tending to personal hygiene happened in plain view of your family members. This forced intimacy, while perhaps fostering strong family bonds, also meant constant negotiations and compromises, especially in times of illness or stress. It's a lifestyle that would challenge even the most patient modern individual. The noise, too, was relentless, not just during the day, but often stretching into the night. The city never truly slept. Night watchmen patrolled their calls echoing through the darkness. The sounds of revelry from taverns, the occasional street brawl, the crying of infants, and the restless movements of animals all contributed to a pervasive background hum that made true quiet a rarity. Sleep for many was likely a fitful and often interrupted affair, adding to the general fatigue and stress of daily life. Even something as simple as getting around was a monumental task. No cars, no public transport. It was all on foot or by animal-drawn cart if you were lucky. Imagine trying to get from one end of the city to the other, navigating the crowds, the mud, the waste, and the various obstacles. It was physically demanding, and for those who had to do it day in and day out, it was exhausting. The concept of a quick errand or a leisurely stroll was vastly different from our modern understanding. Every journey was an expedition. One particularly fascinating, though perhaps less known detail about daily life in Constantinople involves the Byzantine public baths. While often seen as symbols of Roman luxury and hygiene, for the average Constantinopolitan, they were less about spa-like relaxation and more about practical necessity. They were places for communal washing, yes, but they were also social hubs where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and sometimes even political gossip flourished. However, these baths, while offering a semblance of cleanliness, could also be breeding grounds for certain ailments, due to the sheer volume of people and the shared water. It's a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to public health. The diet of the average citizen was another factor contributing to their quality of life. While the wealthy feasted on a variety of meats and exotic spices, the common person relied heavily on bread, vegetables, and pulses. Meat was a luxury consumed perhaps only on feast days. Fish, especially from the nearby Bosporus, was more accessible. While this diet provided basic sustenance, it often lacked the nutritional diversity we take for granted, contributing to various deficiencies and making people more susceptible to illness. Imagine eating essentially the same bland meal day in and day out with little variety or culinary joy. Furthermore, the threat of crime was ever present. With such a dense population and varying levels of wealth, pickpockets and petty thieves roamed the crowded markets and dark alleyways. Violent crime, while perhaps less common, was not unheard of. There was no organized police force, as we understand it, relying instead on local watchmen and the occasional intervention of imperial guards. Justice for the common person could be slow, arbitrary, and often dependent on one's social standing. It's a world where you had to be constantly vigilant, always aware of your surroundings, and ready to defend yourself if necessary. And then there's the omnipresent threat of disease. Forget about antibiotics or even basic germ theory. Illnesses spread like wildfire through the crowded, unsanitary streets. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and various fevers were constant companions. A simple cut could turn deadly due to infection. Child mortality rates were astronomically high. Life expectancy was short, and many succumbed to ailments that we now consider easily treatable. The constant fear of sickness, knowing that a common cold could quickly escalate into something fatal, hung heavy over daily life. This wasn't just a historical fact. It was a deeply personal, terrifying reality for every man, woman, and child. Remember those shared bathhouses? They were often efficient vectors for the spread of these very same diseases. Consider the sheer psychological toll of living in such an environment. The constant noise, the pervasive smells, the lack of privacy, the fear of disease and fire, the physical demands of daily life, it all added up. Stress levels must have been incredibly high, with little in the way of modern coping mechanisms or diversions. Entertainment was simple, often communal, and limited to religious festivals, public spectacles like chariot races or storytelling. There was no escaping the grind, no quiet retreat, no easy way to decompress from the relentless demands of the urban medieval world. It truly makes you appreciate the simple luxuries of your own home and the peace it offers. You've just had your initial, rather unpleasant introduction to the sensory landscape of Constantinople. Now let's talk about the smell. Because truly the scent of the city was an experience in itself, one that modern noses would find almost unbearable. It wasn't just a smell. It was an overwhelming, ever-present, and constantly evolving symphony of odors that permeated every corner, clung to every surface, and doubtless embedded itself deep into the very fabric of your clothing. Imagine stepping out your door each morning and being immediately engulfed by this invisible olfactory blanket. There was no escape. The predominant notes, as you're quickly learning, are those of human and animal waste. Without a sophisticated sewage system, and with the common practice of simply discarding refuse into the streets or open cesspits, the pervasive stench of excrement was unavoidable. On a hot summer's day, this odor would intensify, rising in a putrid wave that made breathing shallow and uncomfortable. Even in cooler weather, the dampness would often amplify the earthy fecal notes, making the air thick and heavy. You try to breathe through your mouth, but even then the taste of the air, a metallic, vaguely sweet, and utterly repulsive flavor, would coat your tongue. This wasn't just an unpleasantness. It was a constant assault, a reminder of the unhygienic conditions that defined daily life. Intermingled with this was the sharp, acrid smell of animal urine and sweat. Horses, donkeys, and mules, indispensable for transportation and labor, left their mark everywhere. Their stalls, often located within courtyards or even adjacent to living quarters, contributed significantly to the local aroma. Imagine the combined effluvium of countless working animals, their waste, mingling with human refuse baking under the sun or dissolving into mud during rain. It's a powerful, almost tangible presence that you can practically taste on your breath. This wasn't a fleeting whiff, it was a persistent cloud that followed you down every street. Then there was the smell of decomposition. Not just food scraps, though, those were certainly present, but the inevitable presence of uncollected waste animal carcasses, and even sometimes human remains that had not been properly disposed of. Decay has a very particular sickly sweet odor that soon turned sour and putrid. In a city where vermin were rampant and sanitation was rudimentary, these smells would linger, a grim testament to the cycle of life and death unfolding on the very streets you walked. You'd learn to associate certain alleyways or market corners with specific, particularly potent stenches and involuntary mapping of the city through your nose. Adding to this complex bouquet was the ever-present scent of wood smoke. Most homes relied on open fires for cooking and heating, and while the smell of a wood fire can be pleasant in small doses, imagine thousands upon thousands of them burning constantly. The smoke would hang heavy in the air, especially on still days, stinging your eyes and coating your throat. It would permeate your clothes, your hair, your skin, leaving a lingering campfire-like aroma that was impossible to wash away completely. It wasn't just from domestic hearths. Blacksmiths' forges, bakers' ovens, and various workshops all contributed to this smoky haze, turning the city into a vast open-air chimney. But it wasn't all simply foul. There were other, perhaps more tolerable smells that punctuated the overwhelming ones. The earthy aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from a bakery, a momentary reprieve that would quickly be drowned out by the dominant stenches. The pungent smell of fermenting grapes from a nearby winery, or the faint, briny tang of fish from the harbor carried on the breeze if you were lucky enough to be near the coast. Spices from distant lands traded in the bustling markets might offer a fleeting exotic note, but these were often overpowered by the more common, less pleasant aromas. The truth is, these occasional pleasantries were just that, fleeting moments in a persistent miasma. The very concept of personal hygiene, as you understand it, was fundamentally different. Bathing was less frequent and often involved communal facilities, as we briefly mentioned. Soap, if available, was a harsh, lye-based concoction, and the concept of scented cleansers or deodorants simply didn't exist. This meant that the natural bodily odors of thousands of people, compounded by sweat grime and unwashed clothing, contributed significantly to the overall atmospheric scent. You'd become accustomed to the distinct smell of unwashed human, a mixture of sweat-stale air and something indefinable that was simply part of being alive in medieval times. It's a realization that perhaps makes you grateful for your daily shower and modern conveniences. Consider the role of public markets in this olfactory landscape. These were bustling hubs where food was bought and sold often without refrigeration. Fish, meat, vegetables, and grains were laid out in the open, attracting flies and emitting their own distinct odors. The smell of decaying produce, spilled liquids, and the general mess of a busy market added another layer to the city's complex aroma. Imagine the butcher's stall with the coppery tang of fresh blood mixing with the richer smell of hanging meat and the less pleasant scent of offal. It was a place of abundance, but also a place where the realities of food production and decay were starkly evident. And then there was the smell of the tanneries and other industrial activities. Tanning hides a vital industry for producing leather, involved the use of strong, often foul-smelling chemicals and animal byproducts. These workshops were typically located on the outskirts of the city or downwind, but on certain days, depending on the wind direction, their pungent chemical odors would waft through the city streets, a harsh, almost burning smell that could make your eyes water. Other crafts like dyeing fabrics also produced their own distinctive, often unpleasant chemical odors, adding to the industrial cocktail. It's clear that the sense of smell was not something to be indulged in medieval Constantinople. It was something to be endured. Your nose constantly bombarded would likely become desensitized to some of the more pervasive smells over time, a survival mechanism of sorts. But even then, certain powerful odors would break through, reminding you of the constant challenges to your comfort and health. It's a stark contrast to our modern world, where we go to great lengths to mask or eliminate unpleasant odors using air fresheners, deodorants, and sophisticated ventilation systems. For the average Byzantine citizen, there was no such luxury. This constant olfactory assault also had practical implications. It was not just an annoyance, it was a clear indicator of the general state of public health and hygiene. The very air you breathed carried the telltale signs of disease vectors and unsanitary conditions. The more pervasive the stench of waste and decay, the higher the likelihood of sickness spreading. It was a tangible link between the environment and the well-being of the populace, a link that, though perhaps not fully understood in terms of germ theory, was certainly experienced on a daily basis. One interesting historical detail is that despite these pervasive odors, there were attempts by the wealthier classes to introduce pleasant scents into their personal spaces. Frankincense and myrrh were burned in churches and wealthy homes, and perfumes often imported from the East were used to mask personal odors. However, these were luxuries far beyond the reach of the common person, and their effect on the overall city atmosphere would have been negligible. It's a reminder of the vast chasm between the lives of the elite and the struggles of the working class. Let's not forget the smell of the market beyond just the food. The mixture of exotic spices from the East, animal dung from the livestock, the sweet scent of dried fruits, and the pungent aroma of various herbs and remedies sold by apothecaries. This created a dynamic and ever-changing olfactory landscape that, while sometimes overwhelming, also hinted at the vast network of trade that sustained the city. You might catch a fleeting whiff of cinnamon or saffron, only to have it quickly replaced by the unmistakable odor of stale fish or unwashed wool. It was a constant push and pull of pleasant and unpleasant, a true reflection of the city's complex life. Imagine living in a small, cramped room with your entire family, where the window, if you even had one, opened onto an alley filled with refuse. The smells from the street would seep into your home, mingling with the odors of cooking, unwashed bodies and whatever personal belongings you possessed. There was no escape, no fresh air to clear the stagnation. This constant, unrefreshing atmosphere would undoubtedly contribute to feelings of fatigue, malaise, and a general sense of being worn down. It's a very different understanding of home sweet home. The use of public latrines where they existed also contributed to the overall smell. While a step up from street defecation, these facilities, often rudimentary and poorly maintained, would quickly become overwhelmed and incredibly pungent. The accumulation of waste in these communal spots would attract vermin and contribute significantly to the local miasma. It's a stark reminder that even attempts at hygiene were often inadequate to cope with the sheer scale of the population and the limitations of medieval technology. This leads to another point of historical debate. Historians continue to debate the extent to which Byzantine authorities genuinely prioritized public health initiatives over other concerns, given the persistence of such widespread sanitation issues throughout the city's history. Even the Byzantines, known for their sophistication in many areas, struggled with the sheer volume of waste generated by a large urban population. It was a problem that confounded rulers and commoners alike, a persistent shadow over the city's otherwise impressive achievements. The sheer scale of the waste problem meant that whatever limited efforts were made, they were constantly fighting an uphill battle against the daily output of thousands of people and animals. It's a testament to how fundamental waste management is to urban living, that even a city as advanced as Constantinople by medieval standards couldn't fully overcome this challenge. And then there's the distinct smell of death, not just from human bodies during times of plague, but also from the routine processing of animals for food and the inevitable presence of animal carcasses in the streets or at the harbor. The coppery scent of blood, the heavier odor of decaying flesh. These were not unfamiliar aromas to the residents of Constantinople. It was a city deeply connected to the realities of life and death, and its smells reflected that raw truth. This was not a sanitized distance version of existence. It was visceral and immediate. So, as you breathe in the air of medieval Constantinople, remember that it's not just a physical sensation, but a deep dive into the very fabric of daily life. It's a powerful reminder of how much our modern world has changed and how much we take for granted. You're not just smelling a city, you're smelling an era, an entire way of life that relied on a very different relationship with the natural world and its consequences. It makes you appreciate the crisp, clean air of your own time, doesn't it? Perhaps you're even holding your breath a little as you imagine it. You've experienced the unyielding smells of Constantinople, but now let's turn our attention to the very ground beneath your feet, the Streets of Peril. These weren't just routes from one place to another. They were dynamic, often dangerous environments fraught with challenges that would make your modern-day commute seem like a stroll through a manicured park. Every step you take in medieval Constantinople is an exercise in vigilance, a constant negotiation with the chaotic realities of urban life. Firstly, the very surface of the streets is a hazard. While some main thoroughfares might boast rough cobblestones, many smaller lanes are simply packed earth, churned into thick, clinging mud during the frequent rains. Imagine trying to navigate these slippery, uneven surfaces, your feet sinking into the muck with every step, the hem of your tunic quickly becoming caked with filth. In drier seasons, these same paths would turn into dusty trails, the fine particulate matter kicked up by countless feet and hooves coating everything in a layer of grime. You'd find yourself constantly trying to brush it off, a futile exercise, as the city itself seemed to conspire to keep you perpetually soiled. Beyond the natural elements, the streets are littered with man-made dangers. As we've touched upon, waste disposal is rudimentary at best. Human and animal excrement, discarded food scraps, and general refuse often line the gutters or are simply tossed from upper windows. You'd have to constantly scan the ground, not just for uneven patches, but to avoid stepping into something truly disgusting. A misstep could mean a sickening squelch, leaving you with an enduring memory and a need for immediate, though difficult, cleaning. This constant vigilance against filth is exhausting in itself, adding a layer of mental fatigue to the physical challenge of walking. But it's not just the static hazards. The streets are alive with movement, and much of it is heedless. Carts, often laden with goods, rumble through the narrow lanes pulled by sturdy oxen or donkeys. These vehicles are not designed for pedestrian safety. They move at their own pace, and you, the pedestrian, are expected to get out of their way. The drivers intent on their journey might offer a gruff shout as they approach, but there's little in the way of warning or courtesy. Imagine stepping around a puddle only to find yourself nearly run over by a cart bearing down on you, its wooden wheels churning through the mud just inches from your feet. Then there are the animals. Not just the working animals like donkeys and horses, but often stray dogs and cats, sometimes even pigs roaming freely. While some might be docile, others could be aggressive, particularly if they are hungry or territorial. A sudden bark or a charging animal could send you scrambling, adding another element of unpredictability to your walk. And of course, wherever animals go, they leave behind their droppings, which, as we've established, contribute to the general mess and slipperiness of the thoroughfare. The sheer density of the population also means constant jostling and bumping. Personal space is a luxury you simply don't have. In crowded market areas, you're pressed in on all sides, the smells and sounds intensified, your movement restricted. Pickpockets skilled in their craft prey on the unsuspecting in such environments. You'd have to keep a tight grip on your meager possessions, constantly aware of who was around you, a subconscious tension that would wear on you over time. A moment of distraction, a brief relaxation of your guard could mean the loss of your precious few coins or a vital tool. Beyond petty crime, the streets could also be venues for more serious altercations. Disputes over business honor or even a simple misunderstanding could quickly escalate into a brawl. There's no effective police presence to swiftly intervene. Justice is often rough and ready dealt with by the participants themselves or by a watchful crowd. Imagine witnessing such an event, perhaps a shouted argument, turning into a flurry of fists and having to quickly navigate around it, hoping not to become an accidental participant or victim. The suddenness and brutality of such encounters would be shocking. And what about after dark? The dangers multiply exponentially. There's little to no street lighting beyond the occasional lantern carried by a wealthy individual or a watchman. The narrow, winding lanes become treacherous in the inky blackness. Hidden potholes, discarded waste, and unseen obstacles become trip hazards. The threat of robbery or assault increases significantly. You'd be foolish to venture out alone after sunset unless absolutely necessary, and even then you'd move quickly, senses on high alert, listening for any suspicious sound in the echoing darkness. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Fires, as we've discussed, were a constant fear, and the streets were often the battleground. If a fire broke out, the narrowness of the lanes and the lack of organized firefighting efforts meant that the blaze could spread rapidly. You might find yourself caught in the path of a rapidly advancing fire, forced to flee through smoke-filled streets, dodging falling embers and collapsing structures. It's a terrifying prospect, a sudden destructive force that could turn your world to ash in minutes, leaving you utterly destitute. One common historical fact often overlooked is that the city's infrastructure, while impressive in some aspects, was ultimately struggling to keep pace with its burgeoning population. The Roman heritage of grand aqueducts and sewers had largely fallen into disrepair, or was simply insufficient for the medieval period. This meant that the streets bore the brunt of the city's waste and decay, transforming them into challenging, unsanitary environments. It's not just a romantic notion of a bygone era, it's a very real historical problem. Consider the occasional public punishments that took place in the streets. While not an everyday occurrence, witnessing a public flogging, the display of criminals in stocks, or even executions would have been a grim reminder of imperial justice. These events meant as deterrents would draw crowds, adding to the congestion and exposing you to the stark, brutal realities of the legal system. It's a jarring reminder that life was cheap, and punishment was often swift and severe, enacted in full view of the populace. Then there's the general jostle and push of daily life. Pedestrians aren't necessarily looking where they're going, focused on their own errands. You'd constantly be dodging people, weaving through crowds, navigating around vendors' stalls that spilled out onto the street, and avoiding the occasional beggar who might impede your path. It's a constant low-level physical engagement that makes every journey an effort, a far cry from the orderly queues and designated pathways of modern urban design. Your personal bubble, a concept we hold dear today, simply doesn't exist. And what about the weather? Imagine heavy rain turning the streets into miniature rivers, carrying refuse and raw sewage along with it. Your feet would be constantly wet, your shoes soaked, increasing the risk of cold chilblains and infection. In winter, the mud could freeze, creating treacherous, icy patches. In summer, the dust would be suffocating, and the baking sun on the unshaded streets would be relentless, leading to heat exhaustion. The elements were not just inconveniences. They were active participants in the daily struggle for survival. One particularly unusual detail you might observe is the presence of the occasional animal carcass simply left where it fell. A stray dog hit by a cart or a sick cat might not be immediately removed, especially in poorer districts. The sight and smell of these decomposing animals would be a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the city's struggle with basic sanitation. It's a stark image that highlights the difference between historical reality and our often sanitized perceptions. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the city's limited municipal laws regarding street cleaning and public order, often suggesting that enforcement was sporadic and largely ineffective outside of the immediate vicinity of imperial palaces or major thoroughfares. This academic debate highlights the practical difficulties of managing such a large, densely populated city with limited resources and an overwhelming amount of waste and human activity. The reality on the ground for the average person was likely far from the ideal outlined in any imperial decree. The lack of proper drainage systems meant that even a moderate rainfall could lead to significant puddles and standing water perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. These stagnant pools, often mixed with human and animal waste, were not merely unsightly. They were vectors for illness, a constant low-level threat to public health that residents would have simply come to accept as part of their environment. It's a grim thought, isn't it? That the very water on the streets could be a source of deadly illness? Finally, consider the psychological impact of living in such a demanding environment. The constant vigilance, the fear of tripping, of being run over, of being robbed, of encountering disease, of being caught in a fire, it all adds up. There's no true sense of security, no feeling that the city is designed for your comfort or safety. Instead, it's a place to be survived, a battleground where every step requires a degree of awareness and resilience that we rarely encounter in our modern lives. The streets of Constantinople weren't just routes. They were an integral part of the medieval urban struggle. They truly test your fortitude, making you appreciate the smooth, clean, and safe pavements of your own time. You can almost feel the aches in your feet, the tension in your shoulders, just imagining it. Having navigated the perilous streets, let's now consider where you'd actually lay your head at night. The homes of humility. Forget sprawling villas or even quaint cottages. For the vast majority of Constantinople's inhabitants, home was a far more modest, often cramped, and frequently uncomfortable affair. It was less a sanctuary and more a shelter, a small bastion against the elements and the chaos of the city outside, but one that offered little in the way of modern comforts or privacy. Picture yourself stepping into such a dwelling. The entrance, likely a simple wooden door, opens directly onto a main living space, often a single room that serves multiple purposes. There's no grand foyer, no separate parlor. This one room is where you'd eat, sleep, socialize, and possibly even work. Imagine a single space, perhaps dimly lit by a small window, if you're lucky enough to have one, or just the doorway itself. The air inside, often stale and heavy, would carry the mingled scents of cooking unwashed bodies and the ever-present dampness that seeped in from the poorly constructed walls. The construction materials themselves speak volumes about the dwelling's quality. While grand public buildings were made of stone and brick, most residential homes were built from a mix of timber frames, often filled with rubble or sun-dried bricks and then plastered over. This construction was prone to dampness, especially in a city with frequent rainfall. You'd likely find patches of mold or mildew on the walls, their musty odor adding to the interior's complex aroma. The plaster, often cracking and peeling, would reveal the rough, uneven surfaces beneath. This wasn't a home built for longevity or comfort, but for utility and quick construction. Space, or rather the lack thereof, is the defining characteristic. For a family, this single room might house multiple generations. Beds would be simple straw pallets laid directly on the floor, perhaps rolled up during the day to create more living space. There would be no separate bedrooms, no private retreats. Every aspect of family life, arguments, laughter, illnesses, intimate moments, would unfold within this shared space in full view and earshot of everyone present. The concept of personal boundaries as we know them simply didn't exist. It's a level of forced intimacy that would challenge any modern family dynamic. Furniture would be sparse and functional. A simple wooden chest might serve as storage and a makeshift table. Perhaps a few low stools or benches. There would be no comfortable armchairs or plush sofas. Everything would be designed for practicality, for maximizing the limited floor space. Decorative items would be rare, limited perhaps to a simple religious icon or a few hand-woven textiles if the family could afford them. The aesthetic was one of necessity, not luxury. Heating was primarily provided by an open hearth, often simply a stone-lined pit in the center of the room or against a wall. The smoke, instead of being efficiently channeled up a chimney, would often fill the room before slowly escaping through a smoke hole in the roof or simply through the door and windows. This meant a constant presence of smoke in the air, stinging your eyes and coating your lungs, especially in winter when ventilation was minimal to conserve heat. Imagine the constant irritation, the lingering smell of smoke in your hair and clothes, and the health implications of inhaling such pollutants day in and day out. Lighting after dark would be minimal. Perhaps a single oil lamp, its flickering flame, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, offering little more than dim illumination. Candles were expensive and reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. This meant that once the sunset, activities were largely curtailed. Reading was difficult needlework, almost impossible. Life largely followed the rhythms of the sun, with evenings spent in relative darkness, perhaps gathered around the hearth for warmth and meager conversation. The lack of proper sanitation extended indoors. There would be no indoor plumbing, no private latrines. Toilets, if present at all, would be communal privies, often shared by multiple families in an apartment block, or simply a bucket emptied into the street. The foul odors from these arrangements would inevitably seep into the living spaces, especially in the absence of proper ventilation. Personal hygiene would be rudimentary, often involving small basins of water and rags, with full bathing being a much less frequent communal affair. The constant presence of grime both on your person and in your living space would be a daily reality. Vermin, as mentioned, were an inescapable part of life. Rats and mice would scurry through walls and across floors drawn by food scraps and general filth. Fleas and lice were endemic, finding their way into straw bedding and clothing. You'd be constantly itching, constantly aware of the unseen creepy crawlies that shared your home. It's a level of infestation that we would find utterly intolerable, but for the medieval inhabitant, it was simply part of the fabric of existence. One common historical fact that often escapes our modern understanding is the sheer vulnerability of these homes to the elements and to disasters. The flimsy construction, the open hearths, and the lack of proper fire breaks meant that a single fire could quickly consume an entire block of homes. The wooden structures packed tightly together would burn like kindling, leaving thousands homeless in minutes. There was no insurance, no social safety net to fall back on. Your home, your possessions, your entire world could vanish in a single night, leaving you utterly destitute. The design of the buildings themselves, particularly the insulae or apartment blocks for the working class, prioritized density over comfort or safety. These multi-story structures were often poorly maintained by absentee landlords, if they even had landlords. Tenants would live in cramped, dark conditions with little control over their environment. The upper stories, often more precarious, might lean precariously over the street, an architectural oddity that also represented a potential hazard. It was a utilitarian approach to housing, driven by the need to cram as many people as possible within the protective but confining city walls. Consider the sounds from outside. Even within the comfort of your home, the noise of the city would penetrate the thin walls. The shouts of vendors, the braying of donkeys, the clatter of carts, the general hubbub of human activity. It would all filter into your living space, a constant reminder of the bustling, chaotic world just beyond your door. True quiet, as we understand it, would be a rare and fleeting luxury. Even at night, the sounds of patrolling watchmen, distant revelry, or the scurry of vermin would interrupt any attempt at peaceful slumber. Sleep itself would be an uneasy affair. The straw pallets would offer little in the way of comfort, quickly becoming matted and perhaps even harboring insects. The cold in winter, the heat in summer, the pervasive dampness, and the constant threat of vermin would make truly restful sleep a challenge. Imagine waking up constantly, perhaps scratching an itch, or shivering from the cold, or simply being unable to escape the oppressive smells. It's a far cry from the soft mattresses and climate-controlled bedrooms we take for granted. One quirky detail that adds to the picture of medieval homes is the reliance on hypocausts or underfloor heating systems for the very wealthy, a remnant of Roman engineering. However, for the vast majority, this was an unimaginable luxury. Their heating methods were primitive and often dangerous, reinforcing the class divide, even within the seemingly universal need for warmth. It's a sharp contrast between the opulent comfort of the elite and the stark reality for the commoner. Historians still debate the average lifespan of these typical timber and brick homes, and how frequently they needed significant repairs or reconstruction due to wear weather or fire. This open question highlights the transient nature of urban housing, for many a constant cycle of decay and rebuilding, driven by necessity rather than deliberate planning or investment in long-term infrastructure. The home wasn't necessarily a cherished permanent asset, but a temporary shelter. Beyond the physical discomfort, there's the sheer vulnerability. These homes offered little in the way of security against intruders. Simple wooden doors and windows, often unbarred, meant that a determined thief could gain entry relatively easily. You'd have to rely on the vigilance of your neighbors or the general social fabric for protection, a far cry from the locks and alarm systems of modern homes. This underlying sense of insecurity would always be present, adding to the stress of daily life. Even simple domestic tasks like cooking were made more difficult by the lack of amenities. Water had to be fetched often from a public fountain or well and carried back to the home. Firewood had to be collected or purchased and stored. Every meal preparation was a labor-intensive process made harder by the smoky conditions and cramped space. There were no ready-made meals, no convenient appliances. Everything was done by hand from scratch, often in dim light and with limited tools. The design of the home also reflected the social structure. There was no concept of a front door separate from a public space or a private garden. Life spilled out into the street, and the street spilled into the home. Neighbors would interact constantly, sharing news, gossip, and sometimes even resources. This communal aspect, while offering support, also meant a lack of personal autonomy and constant social pressure. It truly makes you appreciate the sanctity of your private space, doesn't it? The ability to close your door and truly be alone is a very modern luxury. You've witnessed the humble abodes. Now let's talk about perhaps the most fundamental and immediate aspect of daily survival, a taste of the past. When it comes to food in medieval Constantinople, you're not thinking about gourmet dining experiences or even the diverse options of a modern grocery store. Instead, you're looking at a diet shaped by necessity, seasonality, and the ever-present challenge of preservation in a world without refrigeration. Your palate is about to undergo a significant adjustment. For the vast majority of the population, the daily diet revolved around staples that were cheap, readily available, and filling. Bread was king. Imagine coarse dark loaves, often made from barley or a mixture of grains baked in communal ovens. This wasn't your soft, fluffy white bread. It was dense, hearty, and often quite tough, serving as the primary source of calories and sustenance. You'd eat it with almost every meal, using it to sop up stews or simply as a plain, dry accompaniment. It was the foundation of the diet, and its availability often dictated whether a family ate well or went hungry. Alongside bread, vegetables formed a significant part of the daily intake. Think seasonal produce, cabbages, onions, leeks, garlic, and various root vegetables like turnips and carrots. These would be grown in small plots outside the city walls or brought in from the surrounding countryside. They were often boiled into simple stews or porridges, seasoned sparingly with herbs if available. The concept of fresh salads, while not entirely unknown, would be far less common, and the washing of produce would be rudimentary at best, raising concerns about cleanliness. Legumes were another vital component. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans were cheap, nutritious, and could be stored for long periods. They provided much-needed protein and fiber, often cooked into thick, satisfying porridges or added to vegetable stews. These simple, earthy dishes formed the backbone of many meals, offering warmth and satiety, but little in the way of culinary excitement. It's a pragmatic approach to eating where fuel for the body was the primary concern. Now let's talk about meat. For the average Constantinopolitan, meat was a luxury, not a daily staple. You wouldn't be seeing juicy steaks or roasted chickens often. If meat was consumed, it was typically on feast days or special occasions. When it did appear, it might be mutton, goat, or sometimes pork. Preservation was key. Meat would often be salted, dried, or smoked to prevent spoilage. This processing could make the meat incredibly tough and salty, requiring long cooking times to render it palatable. Imagine the anticipation of a rare meat dish, knowing how much effort and expense went into it. Fish, however, was more accessible, especially given Constantinople's strategic location on the Bosporus. Freshwater fish from nearby rivers and saltwater varieties from the Marmara Sea and the Black Sea were brought to market. Fish would be eaten fresh when possible, but often it was dried, salted, or pickled for preservation. This made fish a more common source of protein than red meat, though its freshness was always a gamble, especially during warmer months. The pungent smell of dried or salted fish would be a common aroma near the harbor and market districts. Dairy products were also part of the diet, though less common than in some other parts of Europe. Cheese, often a hard, salty variety, and yogurt were consumed especially in rural areas. Milk was generally less safe to drink directly due to the lack of pasteurization and refrigeration, leading to quick spoilage and potential illness. So, transformed dairy products were safer and more common. Sweeteners were rare. Honey was the primary source of sweetness, often reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Sugar, if available, was an expensive import. This meant that most dishes were savory, and the concept of elaborate desserts was largely absent from the common diet. Fruits, when in season, would provide a natural sweetness, but outside of their season, they were either unavailable or preserved through drying. Drinking was another matter entirely. Water, as you'll soon discover, was often unreliable and potentially dangerous. To avoid waterborne diseases, many people opted for wine, which was cheap and abundant, even for the working classes. It was usually a thin, watered-down variety, low in alcohol content, consumed throughout the day by adults and even children. The fermentation process made it safer than unboiled water. Imagine having wine with every meal from breakfast to dinner, a far cry from modern drinking habits. The preparation of food was also a laborious process. Without modern kitchen appliances, every step from grinding grain to kneading dough to chopping vegetables was done by hand. Cooking would take place over an open fire or in a simple clay oven. The smoky atmosphere of the home, as we discussed, would be an unavoidable part of meal preparation. Meals were simple, often one-pot affairs designed for maximum sustenance with minimal fuss. One common historical fact to remember is that food preservation was paramount. Without refrigeration, techniques like salting, drying, pickling, and smoking were essential to extend the shelf life of perishable goods. This meant that much of the food you ate would have a distinct, often strong flavor profile due to these preservation methods. Imagine eating heavily salted fish or incredibly dense dry bread day after day. It was a diet of survival, not necessarily enjoyment. And then there's the issue of food safety. Without knowledge of germ theory, cleanliness in food preparation was often lacking. Flies would buzz around exposed food in markets. Meat and fish could sit out for extended periods. Water used for washing or cooking might be contaminated. Food poisoning was a frequent and often severe problem, a constant threat to health that most people would have just attributed to bad humors or ill fortune. You'd learn to be wary of certain vendors or certain foods, relying on your senses of sight and smell to gauge freshness. Street food, while convenient, also came with its own risks. Vendors would sell hot bread pastries, roasted chickpeas, and other quick bites. While these could be a welcome treat, the conditions under which they were prepared were often unsanitary. Imagine grabbing a hot piece of bread from a vendor whose hands are grubby and who stores their wares uncovered, exposed to dust and flies. It's a gamble you might take out of hunger or convenience, but one with potential consequences. One fascinating, though often overlooked detail is the role of communal ovens. For many families, especially those in apartment blocks, baking bread at home was impractical. Instead, they would prepare their dough and take it to a local baker who would bake it in a large communal oven for a small fee. This created a sense of community and efficiency, but also meant that the quality of your bread was dependent on the baker's skill and the cleanliness of the shared facility. Historians still debate the nutritional adequacy of the typical Byzantine diet, particularly for the urban poor, and whether widespread deficiencies contributed to the prevalence of certain diseases. It's a complex question, balancing the availability of certain staples against the lack of diverse nutrients and the impact of frequent illness on absorption. It reminds us that even when food was available, it didn't always equate to good health. Consider also the psychological aspect of such a monotonous diet. Eating largely the same simple fare day in and day out with a little variety or surprise could be soul-crushing. Food wasn't a source of joy or experimentation, it was simply sustenance. The occasional feast day with its rare indulgence in meat or sweeter treats would be a truly celebrated event, a momentary escape from the dietary grind. This makes you appreciate the incredible diversity and abundance in your own pantry and refrigerator, doesn't it? The class divide was starkly visible in diet. While the poor ate their coarse bread and vegetable stews, the wealthy dined on roasted meats, exotic spices, fine wines, and imported fruits. Their tables would groan under the weight of elaborate dishes prepared by skilled cooks. This contrast wasn't just about luxury, it was about power status and a vastly different quality of life. The food you ate was a clear indicator of your place in society. Even the simple act of eating was different. Forks were rare, largely a later invention, so most food was eaten with hands or spoons. This meant a more tactile experience, but also a higher chance of transferring germs from unwashed hands to food. Meals were often communal, shared from a central pot or platter, further increasing the potential for disease transmission. It was a less refined, more direct way of consuming nourishment, reflecting the broader rawness of medieval life. In essence, food in medieval Constantinople was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience in the face of scarcity and difficult conditions. It was about making do with what was available, preserving what you could, and finding sustenance in the simplest of ingredients. While it might not sound appealing to your modern palate, it kept an entire civilization alive, day by day, generation after generation. It truly gives you a new appreciation for every meal you enjoy, doesn't it? Every bite is a reminder of how far we've come. You've managed to acquire some sustenance, but now comes perhaps the most critical element of survival water woes. In medieval Constantinople, accessing clean, safe drinking water was a constant struggle, a daily challenge that posed a significant threat to health and well-being. Forget turning on a tap. The journey for water was arduous and its quality was often questionable, a grim testament to the limits of ancient engineering and urban sanitation. Constantinople was fortunate in having a legacy of impressive Roman-built aqueducts remnants, of which still brought water into the city from distant springs and rivers. These massive engineering feats like the Valens Aqueduct were indeed remarkable. However, the system was old, constantly in need of repair, and often insufficient for the burgeoning population. Water flow could be intermittent, especially during dry spells or if sections of the aqueduct were damaged. Imagine relying on a single aging pipeline for your most vital resource, knowing that its failure could spell disaster. Once the water entered the city, it was distributed through a network of cisterns, large underground reservoirs designed to collect and store water. Some of these, like the Basilica Cistern Yerbatan Sarnıcı or the cistern of Philoxenos Binberdurek Sarnıcı, were monumental in scale, capable of holding vast quantities of water. While impressive, these cisterns were not always pristine. They could become stagnant, allowing algae to grow, and were often susceptible to contamination from various sources. Imagine drawing water from a vast, dark underground pool, knowing that it might contain more than just pure, refreshing liquid. For the average citizen, obtaining water meant a trip to a public fountain or a well. These communal water points were social hubs, bustling with activity, but also potential sites for germ transmission. You'd join a queue perhaps for hours during peak times or dry spells, carrying heavy ceramic jars or animal skin bags. Imagine the physical strain of carrying several gallons of water back to your home, often over uneven, muddy streets day after day. It was a chore that consumed a significant portion of a woman's or child's day, a relentless physical demand. The quality of the water was a constant concern. While efforts were made to bring in fresh spring water, the open channels of the aqueducts and the large open-air cisterns were vulnerable to contamination. Animal waste, dust leaves, and even human refuse could find their way into the system. Without modern filtration or chlorination, the water could harbor bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Drinking water was a gamble. A clear appearance didn't necessarily mean it was safe. You learned to rely on boiling water for cooking, but for drinking directly, it was a leap of faith. This leads to a practical historical fact: the widespread consumption of wine. As we briefly touched upon, wine was often safer to drink than water, because the fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria. Even children would drink watered-down wine, not for the alcohol content, but for the basic safety it offered. It was a pragmatic solution to a very real problem born out of necessity, rather than preference for intoxication. This sheds light on why wine was such an integral part of the daily diet across all social strata. Beyond drinking, water was essential for cooking, cleaning, and personal hygiene. Imagine trying to wash your clothes, bathe yourself or your children, or clean your home with limited, often unclean water supplies. The concept of daily bathing or flushing toilets was simply alien. Water was too precious, too difficult to obtain, and often too contaminated to be used freely for such purposes. This scarcity directly contributed to the overall unsanitary conditions of the city and its inhabitants. The wealthy, of course, had better access. Their private homes might have small dedicated cisterns or even direct pipelines from the main aqueduct system, offering a more reliable and often cleaner supply. They might employ servants to fetch and filter water, reducing the burden and the risk. This disparity in access to a fundamental resource further highlighted the stark class divisions within the city, where even basic needs were subject to social standing. During sieges which Constantinople experienced numerous times throughout its long history, the water supply became a critical strategic vulnerability. If an enemy could cut off the aqueducts or poison the cisterns, the city would be forced to surrender or face mass dehydration and disease. This meant that the water infrastructure was constantly guarded and considered a prime target during wartime. The very survival of the city often hinged on its ability to maintain its water supply. One particularly grim detail related to water woes is the prevalence of waterborne diseases. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were common scourges spreading rapidly through contaminated water sources. The link between tainted water and illness was not understood in terms of germ theory, but people certainly observed that sickness often followed periods of poor water quality. Imagine the constant fear, the debilitating sickness, and the high mortality rates caused by something as fundamental as the water you drank. Every sip was a potential Russian roulette. Historians still debate the efficacy of Byzantine attempts to maintain and repair their complex water systems, particularly in later periods of the empire's decline, and how much deterioration of the infrastructure directly impacted public health. This academic discussion points to the constant struggle of a large city to sustain its vital services over centuries, especially when resources might be diverted to other more immediate concerns like military defense. The disposal of wastewater was another critical issue. Without a proper sewage system, the water used for washing or cooking would often be simply thrown into the streets or collected in rudimentary drains that emptied into the same already polluted thoroughfares. This created a vicious cycle of contamination, where clean water once brought into the city quickly became part of the problem, mingling with waste and contributing to the overall unsanitary environment. The water you brought in with such effort would quickly become tainted upon use. Consider the role of wells within the city. While some might draw from underground springs, many shallow wells would be highly susceptible to contamination from surface runoff cesspits and general urban filth. Using well water, particularly in densely populated areas, was an even greater risk than water from the main aqueduct system. Yet for some it might have been the only accessible option, particularly in outlying districts. The seasonal variations also played a significant role. During periods of heavy rainfall, the aqueducts might be overwhelmed, leading to flooding in certain areas and also increased contamination of surface water. During long, hot summers, water levels in cisterns and aqueducts could drop dangerously low, leading to severe water shortages and even greater reliance on potentially unsafe sources. Life was dictated by the unpredictable rhythm of the climate and its direct impact on this vital resource. Even the architecture reflects the water problem. Many homes in Constantinople were built with small internal courtyards that might have a private well or a small cistern to collect rainwater. This was an attempt by individual households to gain some autonomy over their water supply, but these smaller, often unlined cisterns were even more vulnerable to contamination and rapid depletion. It was a workaround, but far from a perfect solution. In essence, the water situation in medieval Constantinople was a constant tightrope walk between necessity and danger. Every drink was a potential risk, every washing a compromise. It truly puts into perspective the effortless access to clean, potable water that we enjoy today, the invisible infrastructure that supports our entire way of life. Imagine the relief the sheer physical and mental burden lifted if you could simply turn on a tap and trust what came out. For the residents of Constantinople, such a luxury was the stuff of dreams. Having touched upon the precariousness of water, let's delve into perhaps the most terrifying and inescapable aspect of urban living in medieval Constantinople: sickness and superstition. In a world without germ theory, antibiotics, or widespread effective medicine, illness was a constant shadowy companion capable of striking anyone down at any moment. Your understanding of health and disease, your very concept of what it means to be well, would be utterly transformed by the medieval reality. Imagine a simple cut on your hand. Today, you'd clean it, apply an antiseptic, perhaps a band-aid, and think little more of it. In Constantinople, that simple cut could become a death sentence. Without knowledge of bacteria, infections spread rapidly. A red streak appearing on your arm, a fever developing the swelling and pus. These were terrifying signs of an internal battle your body was losing. Sepsis, once it took hold, was almost always fatal. The casualness with which we treat minor injuries today would be a fatal luxury in that era. The diseases that plagued Constantinople were rampant and varied. Dysentery caused by contaminated food and water would lead to debilitating diarrhea, dehydration, and often death, especially among children. Typhoid fever. Another waterborne illness brought high fevers, weakness, and intestinal bleeding. Smallpox, a viral scourge, left survivors disfigured and often blind, while many others simply succumbed to its virulent attack. And then, of course, there were the recurring outbreaks of plague, a terrifying epidemic that could decimate populations in a matter of weeks, leaving piles of bodies and widespread panic in its wake. Remember those narrow streets and crowded homes, perfect breeding grounds for such epidemics. When illness struck, the options for treatment were limited and often ineffective. Medical knowledge, while advanced for its time compared to some parts of Europe, was still largely based on ancient Greek humoral theory, which posited that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments therefore often involved bleeding, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, or applying poultices made of herbs and other substances, some of which were genuinely medicinal, many others completely useless and some even harmful. Picture a physician of the era. They might be skilled in diagnosis through observation, examining urine, pulse, and skin, but their tools were crude, their understanding of internal processes limited. A broken bone might be splinted, but infections were untreatable. Surgery was rare and incredibly dangerous, undertaken only as a last resort due to the agonizing pain and near certainty of infection. Imagine facing a serious illness knowing that your best hope lay in the hands of someone who believed in rebalancing your humors, not in attacking specific pathogens. Superstition played a huge role, often intertwined with religious belief. When logical explanations for disease were absent, people turned to divine intervention, curses, or supernatural forces. A sudden illness might be seen as punishment for sins, the work of demons, or the result of an evil eye. This led to a reliance on prayers, religious relics, amulets, and pilgrimages, often alongside or instead of medical treatment. You might wear a charm to ward off evil or visit a saint's shrine hoping for a miraculous cure that no physician could provide. The fear of contagion was palpable, though poorly understood. During outbreaks of plague, people would flee the city if they could, abandoning their homes and livelihoods in a desperate bid to escape the unseen killer. Those who remained would isolate themselves, avoid contact with the sick, and perhaps burn aromatic herbs to purify the air. But without knowledge of how diseases actually spread, these measures were often insufficient, leading to widespread panic and a breakdown of social order. One particularly grim historical fact is the staggering infant mortality rate. A significant portion of children would not survive to adulthood, succumbing to childhood diseases, malnutrition, or poor sanitation. Parents would experience the heartbreak of losing multiple children, a common tragedy that nevertheless left deep emotional scars. This meant that families were often large in the desperate hope that some offspring would survive to carry on the family name and provide support in old age. It was a brutal reality of life. Consider the role of public hospitals. While some hospitals existed often attached to monasteries or imperial foundations, they were not places of healing in the modern sense. They were more akin to hospices, offering care and comfort to the dying, rather than effective medical treatment that could cure illness. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the lack of proper medical knowledge meant that entering a hospital was often seen as a final desperate act rather than a path to recovery. And then there's the psychological toll. The constant presence of sickness, the knowledge that any ache or cough could escalate into something deadly, the memory of loved ones lost to disease. This would create an underlying layer of anxiety and fatalism in daily life. There was no certainty of a healthy future, no expectation of longevity. Life was fragile and death was a constant visible companion. It would shape your entire worldview, making you appreciate every day of health as a precious, fleeting gift. One quirky detail often cited is the use of Byzantine folk remedies, some of which seem bizarre to us now. For instance, the application of pigeon droppings to specific ailments, or the use of ground-up mummies in certain concoctions, reflecting a blend of ancient practices and local beliefs. While some of these might have had incidental antiseptic properties, or a placebo effect, many were clearly based on superstition rather than scientific understanding. Historians still debate the true impact of ancient medical texts and theories such as those of Galen and Hippocrates on the practical application of medicine in Byzantine society, and whether access to these texts translated into widespread effective treatment for the common person. This open question highlights the gap between theoretical knowledge and real-world implementation, particularly in a context of limited resources and a lack of scientific methodology. The social implications of sickness were profound. A prolonged illness could mean financial ruin for a family as the sick person couldn't work, and resources would be drained for care and remedies. Without a social safety net, illness could quickly plunge a family into destitution. The healthy often avoided the sick, fearing contagion, leading to isolation and abandonment for those afflicted. It was a world where illness not only attacked the body but could destroy a family's entire economic and social standing. Even dentistry was a terrifying prospect. Tooth decay was common due to diet, and the only treatment for a severely aching tooth was extraction, often performed by a barber surgeon with rudimentary tools and no anesthesia. Imagine the excruciating pain, the risk of infection, and the sheer terror of such an ordeal. You'd likely endure a toothache for as long as humanly possible, preferring the constant pain to the agony of removal. The lack of understanding about mental health was also stark. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or psychosis were often attributed to demonic possession, divine wrath, or imbalances of the humors. Treatment, if any, could involve religious rituals, exorcisms, or harsh physical treatments that often did more harm than good. Compassion for those with mental afflictions was rare, and they were often ostracized or subjected to cruel treatment. In essence, living in medieval Constantinople meant living with the constant, terrifying presence of illness. It was a battle fought not just by individuals, but by the entire society, armed with limited knowledge and often desperate remedies. The pervasive fear, the high mortality rates, and the lack of effective cures shaped daily life in profound ways, making every healthy day a blessing and every sickness a harrowing ordeal. It truly makes you appreciate the miracles of modern medicine and public health, doesn't it? The ability to ward off so many of those historical scourges is a testament to progress.